The morning sun cast long shadows across the railroad tracks that cut through the heart of Pine Ridge Reservation. Sarah Whitefeather, only 8 years old, skipped along the gravel path beside the rails, her worn sneakers crunching on the small stones. She carried a basket her grandmother had woven, filled with wild berries she had picked near the creek. Her long black hair danced in the gentle breeze as she hummed a traditional song her mother taught her. Sarah lived with her grandmother in a small wooden house painted blue, with a garden full of corn, beans, and squash. Her parents worked in the city, sending money home while she stayed on the reservation to learn the old ways. Every morning she would walk this same path to visit her great-aunt who lived on the other side of the tracks. The railroad brought both good and bad to their community. It brought supplies and visitors, but it also brought trouble. Strange men had been seen around the reservation lately, men who didn't belong and asked too many questions about the land. The elders whispered concerns during their evening gatherings, speaking in hushed tones about developers and mining companies. As Sarah approached the old wooden bridge where the tracks crossed over Willow Creek, she noticed something unusual. 3 men in expensive suits stood near a black SUV parked on the dirt road that ran parallel to the tracks. They were pointing at different areas of the land and taking pictures. One of them held papers that looked official. Sarah tried to walk quietly past them, but her foot kicked a loose piece of gravel. The sound echoed in the morning stillness, and all 3 men turned to look at her. Their eyes were cold and calculating, and something about their stares made her skin crawl. She clutched her berry basket tighter and quickened her pace. "Hey, little girl," one of them called out. He was tall with gray hair and wore a gold watch that caught the sunlight. "Come here for a minute." Sarah's grandmother had always told her never to talk to strangers, especially men who looked like they didn't belong on the reservation. She pretended not to hear and kept walking, her heart beating faster with each step. Behind her, she could hear the men talking in low voices, but she couldn't make out their words. The path curved ahead, taking her away from their view. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding, and continued toward her great-aunt's house. The berries bounced gently in her basket as she walked, and she tried to push the memory of those cold eyes from her mind. When she reached her great-aunt's house, the old woman was sitting on her porch, working on a beautiful beadwork design. Her weathered hands moved with practiced precision, creating patterns that told stories of their ancestors. "Grandmother Mary," Sarah called out, using the respectful term for elders. "I brought you berries from the creek." The old woman looked up and smiled, her face creasing into familiar lines of warmth. "Come sit with me, child. You look troubled." Sarah climbed the wooden steps and settled beside her great-aunt, setting the basket down carefully. She told her about the strange men by the tracks and how they had called out to her. Grandmother Mary's expression grew serious as she listened. She had lived through many changes on the reservation, and she could sense when danger was approaching like a storm on the horizon. "Those men have been coming around for weeks," she said quietly. "They work for a company that wants to buy our land. They promise money, but they take everything that matters." Sarah didn't fully understand what this meant, but she could see the worry in her great-aunt's eyes. The old woman continued her beadwork, but her movements were less steady now. "You must be very careful, little one," Grandmother Mary warned. "Stay close to home and always tell someone where you're going. These men, they don't respect our ways or our people." The rest of Sarah's visit passed peacefully. They shared the berries and talked about easier things like the upcoming harvest festival and the new foal that had been born at the neighbor's ranch. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Sarah knew she had to return home to help her grandmother with the day's chores. The walk back seemed longer somehow. Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the black SUV following her. The railroad track stretched endlessly in both directions, silver rails gleaming under the noon sun. As she neared the spot where she had seen the men earlier, Sarah noticed they were gone. Only tire tracks in the soft earth showed they had ever been there. She felt relieved but also strangely uneasy, as if she was being watched from somewhere she couldn't see. The reservation felt different now, less safe than it had that morning. Sarah quickened her pace, eager to reach the comfort of her grandmother's kitchen where the smell of fry bread would welcome her home. Unknown to Sarah, the 3 men had not gone far. They sat in their SUV on a hill overlooking the valley, watching the small figure make her way along the tracks. The man with the gold watch pulled out a cell phone and made a call. "We've found our leverage," he said into the phone, his voice cold and businesslike. "One way or another, we're going to get that land." The seeds of a terrible plan were already taking root in his mind. A plan that would soon shatter the peaceful morning routine of one innocent little girl and awaken something fierce and protective in the heart of a Lakota warrior who had been waiting for the right moment to strike back against those who threatened his people. 3 days after Sarah's encounter with the strange men, the reservation buzzed with tension. More black vehicles had been spotted around the area, and several families reported men in suits taking photographs of their homes and land. The tribal council held emergency meetings, but the visitors claimed to be conducting legal surveys for the railroad company. Thomas Red Hawk knew better. The former Army Ranger had returned to the reservation 5 years earlier, after serving 3 tours overseas. His dark eyes missed nothing, and his military training had taught him to recognize threats long before they became dangerous. He worked as a security consultant now, but his real job was protecting his people from exactly this kind of intrusion. Thomas had been tracking the movements of these outsiders since they first appeared. He knew they worked for Blackstone Development, a company with a reputation for acquiring Native American land through questionable means. They specialized in finding legal loopholes and applying pressure until communities were forced to sell. On this particular morning, Thomas sat in his pickup truck on a ridge overlooking the railroad tracks. Through his binoculars, he watched Sarah Whitefeather make her daily walk to visit her great-aunt. The little girl had no idea that she was being observed by more than just Thomas. Hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees near the tracks, 2 of the men from Blackstone waited with equipment that looked more suited for hunting than surveying. Thomas felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the signs of a planned abduction. These men were about to cross a line that would change everything. Sarah skipped along the tracks, humming the same traditional song as always. Her berry basket swung at her side, and she paused occasionally to pick wildflowers that grew between the railroad ties. She had no reason to suspect that today would be different from any other. The freight train that came through at 11:30 every morning was running right on schedule. Thomas could hear its distant whistle echoing across the valley. The sound that usually brought comfort to the reservation community now filled him with dread as he realized what the men were planning. Through his binoculars, Thomas watched one of the men emerge from the trees as Sarah approached. The little girl tried to run, but the second man appeared behind her, cutting off her escape route. They grabbed her quickly, professional in their movements, and Thomas knew this wasn't their first kidnapping. Sarah's screams pierced the morning air, but the nearest house was half a mile away, and the approaching train would soon drown out any sound. Thomas was already moving, his pickup truck roaring to life as he raced down the hillside toward the tracks. The men worked with practiced efficiency. They had rope and were securing Sarah to the railroad tracks, positioning her so that the oncoming train would pose a real threat, but still allow time for negotiation. This wasn't meant to be murder, Thomas realized, but psychological warfare aimed at breaking the community's resistance to selling their land. One of the kidnappers pulled out a video camera while the other made a phone call. Thomas could see their plan unfolding. They would film the terrified child, use the footage to pressure the tribal council, and then rescue her at the last moment in exchange for signatures on land transfer documents. The train's whistle grew louder, and Thomas could see the locomotive in the distance. A massive diesel engine pulling a long line of freight cars. The engineer wouldn't be able to see Sarah until it was too late to stop, given the curve in the tracks just before the spot where she was tied. Thomas abandoned his truck while it was still moving and sprinted the final 100 yards to the railroad tracks. His military training kicked in, and he assessed the situation with the cold precision of a combat veteran. 2 armed men, 1 child in immediate danger, and less than 3 minutes before the train would reach her position. The first kidnapper saw Thomas approaching and reached for something inside his jacket. Thomas didn't hesitate. His throwing knife, a skill learned from his grandfather and perfected in the military, found its target before the man could draw his weapon. The second kidnapper spun around just as Thomas reached the tracks. "You're too late, Indian," the man sneered, holding up a cell phone. "This is already being broadcast live to your tribal council. 1 word from me and we let the train finish what we started." Sarah lay tied to the tracks, her eyes wide with terror but her spirit unbroken. She had stopped screaming and was now looking directly at Thomas, somehow understanding that this man represented hope. Her lips moved in what Thomas recognized as a traditional prayer his own grandmother had taught him. The train was close enough now that Thomas could feel the vibrations through the steel rails. The engineer had finally spotted something on the tracks ahead and was laying on the horn continuously. But the massive freight train would need at least half a mile to stop completely. "What do you want?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Simple," the kidnapper replied. "Your people sign over the mineral rights to this entire section, and the little girl lives. Refuse and, well..." He gestured toward the approaching train. Thomas pretended to consider the offer while calculating distances and timing in his head. The man was standing too close to Sarah, making a direct attack impossible without risking her safety. But Thomas hadn't survived 3 combat tours by accepting impossible situations. "You made one mistake," Thomas said calmly, his voice barely audible over the approaching train. "What's that?" "You assumed I came alone." The kidnapper's eyes widened as he suddenly realized that Thomas's truck hadn't been the only vehicle racing toward the tracks. A dozen pickup trucks were converging on their position from multiple directions, each one carrying armed members of the reservation's volunteer security force. But even with help arriving, Thomas knew they were running out of time. The train was less than a minute away, and Sarah was still tied to the tracks. The kidnapper's finger hovered over his phone, ready to give whatever signal would seal the little girl's fate. Thomas had to make a choice that would define not just this moment, but everything that came after. The warrior spirit that had kept his ancestors free for generations stirred within him, and he knew that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to become something that others would fear. The train's horn echoed across the valley like a war cry, and Thomas Redhawk prepared to show these invaders exactly what it meant to threaten a child of the Lakota people. Thomas Redhawk moved with the fluid precision of a predator. In one smooth motion, he dropped low and rolled toward the railroad tracks using the slight embankment for cover. The kidnapper with the phone tried to track his movement but lost sight of him for a crucial second. That second was all Thomas needed. His grandfather had taught him to move like smoke across the prairie, and his military training had refined that natural ability into something deadly. Thomas came up behind the kidnapper in a position the man never expected, having approached from an angle that seemed impossible given the open ground. "Drop the phone," Thomas whispered, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made grown men obey without question. The kidnapper spun around, but Thomas was already moving again. A quick strike to the man's wrist sent the phone flying, and a follow-up blow to his solar plexus dropped him to his knees, gasping for breath. Meanwhile, the backup vehicles Thomas had mentioned were indeed real. His cousin Jake Redhawk led the charge in his modified pickup truck, followed by 6 other vehicles filled with reservation security volunteers. They had been monitoring radio communications and had mobilized the moment Thomas called in the emergency. But even with help arriving, the train was now less than 30 seconds away from Sarah's position. Thomas could see the terror in the little girl's eyes, but also something else, something that reminded him of his own grandmother's unbreakable spirit in the face of adversity. "Sarah," Thomas called out as he worked frantically to untie the ropes. "Remember what your grandmother taught you about being brave. The ancestors are watching over you." The ropes were tied with professional knots designed to be difficult to remove quickly. Thomas pulled out his combat knife and began cutting through them, but the thick rope was tougher than expected. The train's headlight was now visible around the curve, and its horn was blaring continuously as the engineer applied the emergency brakes. Jake Redhawk's truck skidded to a stop just yards away from the tracks, and he jumped out with bolt cutters in hand. "Move aside, cousin!" he shouted over the noise of the approaching train. The bolt cutters made quick work of the ropes, and Thomas scooped Sarah into his arms just as the train thundered past, its wind and noise creating a wall of chaos. The little girl buried her face against Thomas's chest, her small body trembling but safe. The kidnapper Thomas had disabled was trying to crawl away, but Jake and 2 other men quickly surrounded him. The second kidnapper, the one Thomas had dealt with first, was unconscious but alive. Both men would face justice, but not the kind they expected from the American legal system. As the train disappeared around the next curve, an unusual quiet settled over the scene. Thomas set Sarah down gently and knelt beside her, checking for injuries. Apart from some rope burns on her wrists and the psychological trauma of her ordeal, she appeared to be physically unharmed. "Are you hurt anywhere, little sister?" Thomas asked, using the traditional term of endearment. Sarah shook her head, her voice small but steady when she spoke. They said they were going to hurt my grandmother if I screamed too much. Are they going to hurt her now? No one is going to hurt your grandmother or anyone else in our community, Thomas assured her. These men made a serious mistake when they decided to threaten our children. Jake approached with his hands zip-tied behind their captives. Both kidnappers were conscious now, and looking around nervously at the growing crowd of reservation residents who were arriving at the scene. Word traveled fast in their tight-knit community, and people were coming to see for themselves what had happened. What do we do with them? Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already had some ideas. Thomas stood and studied the two men who had been willing to traumatize a child to achieve their corporate goals. In the old days, their fate would have been decided quickly and permanently. But Thomas understood that they lived in a different world now, one where justice had to be more strategic. We're going to send a message, Thomas said quietly, but not the way they expect. He walked over to the kidnapper with the gold watch, the one who had first called out to Sarah 3 days earlier. The man was trying to maintain his composure, but Thomas could see the fear in his eyes. You made a video, didn't you? Thomas asked. Something to show your bosses and scare our tribal council. The man remained silent, but Thomas had already spotted the small camera they had been using. He picked it up and scrolled through the recorded footage until he found what he was looking for. The video showed everything: the kidnapping, the ropes being tied, Sarah's terrified face as the train approached. It was evidence of attempted murder and would be more than enough to destroy Blackstone. Development's reputation and land grab schemes. But Thomas had a better idea than simply turning the evidence over to authorities who might be influenced by corporate money. He understood the power of modern technology and social media in ways that surprised people who saw him as just another reservation Indian. Jake, call your daughter, Thomas said, the one who works for that news station in Rapid City. Tell her we have a story that's going to go viral. While Jake made the call, Thomas addressed the growing crowd of community members who had gathered around the railroad tracks. His words were spoken in Lakota first, then translated to English for those who needed it. Today, these men crossed a line that should never be crossed, he began. They put one of our children in danger to try to steal our land. But they made a mistake. They thought we were weak. They thought we would be afraid. The crowd murmured agreement, and Thomas could feel the anger building among his people. It was a righteous anger, the kind that had fueled resistance for generations. We're not going to respond with violence, Thomas continued. We're going to respond with something much more powerful. We're going to show the world who these people really are and what they're willing to do for money. Sarah's grandmother arrived at that moment, having heard about the incident from neighbors. She ran to her granddaughter and held her tight, tears streaming down her weathered face. The sight of the elderly woman's relief and the child's trauma crystallized something in Thomas's mind. These corporate predators had made their choice when they decided to target the most vulnerable members of his community. Now it was time for them to face the consequences of awakening something they didn't understand. The protective fury of a people who had survived genocide and would not allow their children to be threatened. The real battle was just beginning, and Thomas Redhawk was ready to show Blackstone Development and anyone else who might be watching that there were still warriors among the Lakota people. Warriors who fought with honor but without mercy when their families were threatened. Within 6 hours of Sarah's rescue, the story had exploded across social media platforms with the force of a digital wildfire. Jake's daughter, Maria Redhawk, worked as an investigative journalist for Coda TV, and she understood immediately that this wasn't just a local news story, but a national scandal waiting to unfold. The footage from the kidnapper's own camera told a story that no corporate spin could cover up. An 8-year-old Lakota girl tied to railroad tracks by men in expensive suits, a freight train bearing down on her, all while one of them filmed for what could only be described as a ransom video aimed at an entire community. Maria had connections throughout the media industry, and she made sure the story reached every major news outlet simultaneously. By evening, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and dozens of online news platforms were running the story with headlines like, "Corporate kidnappers target Native American child and land. Grab scheme includes attempted murder," but Thomas Redhawk wasn't content to let others control the narrative. He had spent years studying his enemies, and he knew that Blackstone Development was just the visible face of a much larger operation. The real power behind the land grab came from international mining conglomerates who wanted access to the rare earth minerals that lay beneath reservation land. That evening, Thomas sat in his small office above the reservation's community center, surrounded by multiple computer monitors and communication equipment that would have impressed his old Army intelligence unit. Most people saw him as a traditional warrior, but Thomas understood that modern battles were fought with information as much as weapons. His investigation into Blackstone development had uncovered a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and political connections that reached into the highest levels of state and federal government. The attempted kidnapping of Sarah Whitefeather hadn't been a desperate move by rogue agents, but part of a carefully planned campaign to acquire mineral-rich Native American land across the entire region. Thomas's phone rang, interrupting his research. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was from Washington, D.C. Mr. Redhawk? The voice was smooth, professional, and carried the kind of confidence that came from wielding real power. My name is Richard Blackstone. I believe we need to talk. Thomas had been expecting this call. Richard Blackstone was the CEO of Blackstone Development, and according to Thomas's research, the frontman for a consortium of international investors who had been systematically targeting indigenous land rights across North America. I have nothing to say to you, Thomas replied calmly. I think you do, Blackstone continued. What happened today was an unfortunate misunderstanding. My employees exceeded their authority, and I want to make things right. I'm prepared to offer your community a very generous settlement to put this matter behind us. You mean the matter where your people tried to murder a child to steal our land? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Blackstone spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. Mr. Redhawk, I've looked into your background. Former Army Ranger, Bronze Star, security clearance that suggests you've seen things most people never will. You understand how the world really works. Thomas did understand, which was exactly why he wasn't going to be intimidated by corporate doublespeak. I understand that you made a mistake today, Thomas said. You thought you were dealing with a poor, isolated community that would be too afraid to fight back. You were wrong. Everyone has a price, Mr. Redhawk. What's yours? The question hung in the air for a moment. Thomas thought about Sarah's terrified face, about her grandmother's tears, about all the other communities across the country that had been pressured into selling their heritage for corporate profit. My price is simple, Thomas said. You and your company leave our land and never come back. You drop all legal challenges to our mineral rights, and you publicly apologize for what happened to Sarah Whitefeather. Blackstone laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. That's not going to happen. Do you have any idea how much money is at stake here? The rare earth deposits under your reservation are worth billions of dollars. We're not walking away from that kind of investment. Then you're going to learn what happens when you threaten Lakota children, Thomas replied, and hung up the phone. Within an hour of that conversation, Thomas received another call, this one from FBI agent Jennifer Martinez. She informed him that the Bureau was opening a federal investigation into the attempted kidnapping, but her tone suggested there might be complications. Mr. Redhawk, I need to be honest with you, Agent Martinez said. Blackstone Development has some very powerful friends in Washington. There's going to be pressure to handle this quietly, maybe with a plea bargain that keeps the bigger picture from coming out. Thomas had expected this too. Corporate power in America extended deep into the justice system, and he knew that the two kidnappers might serve minimal sentences while their bosses walked free. Agent Martinez, can I ask you something? Thomas said. Do you have children? Yes, a daughter about Sarah's age. Then you understand why I can't let this go away quietly. There was a long pause before the FBI agent spoke again. What are you planning to do? I'm going to give them a choice, Thomas said. They can face justice in the American legal system, where their money and connections might protect them, or they can face justice the way my ancestors would have handled it. Mr. Redhawk, I can't have you taking the law into your own hands. I'm not taking anything, Thomas replied. But if they want to play games with our children, they're going to discover that some games have consequences they never considered. After ending the call with Agent Martinez, Thomas turned back to his computers. The story of Sarah's rescue was still spreading across social media, but Thomas was planning something much more comprehensive. He had been collecting information on Blackstone Development and similar companies for months, and now he had both the motivation and the platform to expose the entire network. Over the next several hours, Thomas uploaded terabytes of documents to secure servers around the world. Financial records showing illegal payments to government officials, environmental reports that had been suppressed, internal communications discussing tactics for intimidating Native American communities, and evidence of similar operations in Canada, Mexico, and South America. The digital warriors of Anonymous and other hacktivist groups had already taken an interest in Sarah's story, and Thomas made sure they had access to everything he had uncovered. If Blackstone Development wanted to play hardball, they were about to discover that they had awakened something much more dangerous than one angry Native American veteran. As dawn approached over Pine Ridge Reservation, Thomas Redhawk prepared for the second phase of his campaign. The rescue of Sarah Whitefeather had been just the beginning. Now it was time to make sure that no other child would ever face what she had endured, and that the people responsible would pay a price that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider similar tactics. The hunt was about to begin, and Thomas Redhawk was exceptionally good at hunting. The war against Blackstone Development began at exactly 3:47 a.m. Mountain Time, when Thomas Redhawk pressed the enter key on his laptop. In that moment, 3 years of careful investigation and preparation unleashed a digital avalanche that would destroy the company and everyone connected to it. The first wave hit Blackstone's servers like a cyber tsunami. Every internal email, financial record, and confidential document that Thomas had secretly copied during months of careful infiltration suddenly appeared on WikiLeaks, the websites of major newspapers and social media platforms around the world. The Anonymous Collective had been waiting for this moment, and their network amplified the data dump to reach millions of people within hours. Richard Blackstone's personal emails revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Messages between him and government officials showed bribes being paid to expedite land seizures. Communications with mining executives in China and Russia proved that American reservation land was being sold to foreign interests. Most damaging of all were the recordings Thomas had made of phone calls where company executives discussed using enhanced persuasion techniques against Native American communities. By sunrise, Blackstone's stock price had crashed by 60% and trading was suspended. Federal prosecutors were already preparing indictments, and international human rights organizations were calling for investigations. But Thomas wasn't satisfied with financial destruction alone. These people had threatened Sarah Whitefeather, and in the old way of his ancestors, that debt could only be paid in blood or total humiliation. The second wave of Thomas's attack was more personal and infinitely more terrifying to his targets. Using skills learned from both his grandfather and his Army Special Operations training, Thomas began hunting the individuals responsible for Sarah's kidnapping with the patience and precision of a wolf stalking wounded prey. Marcus Webb, one of the men who had tied Sarah to the railroad tracks, was released on bail pending trial. He thought expensive lawyers and political connections would protect him, just as they had protected him during previous operations against indigenous communities in Alaska and Wyoming. Webb was wrong. Thomas found him in a luxury hotel in Denver where Webb was hiding from the media attention. The former kidnapper was drinking heavily at the hotel bar, trying to forget the image of a terrified 8-year-old girl that haunted his dreams. Thomas appeared beside him like a shadow, wearing casual clothes that made him look like just another hotel guest. "Marcus Webb," Thomas said quietly, taking the seat beside him. "We need to talk." Webb's blood froze when he recognized the voice. He had seen Thomas rescue Sarah, had watched him move with the deadly grace of a trained killer. Now sitting alone in a dimly lit bar with the man whose people he had terrorized, Webb understood that his corporate protectors were thousands of miles away. "I didn't hurt the girl," Webb said, his voice shaking. "It was just supposed to scare them." "Just supposed to scare them," Thomas repeated thoughtfully. "You tied an 8-year-old child to railroad tracks with a freight train bearing down on her, and you thought that was acceptable?" Thomas's tone was conversational, almost friendly, which made his presence even more terrifying. Webb had dealt with angry people before, but this man radiated the kind of controlled violence that came from years of professional killing. "What do you want from me?" Webb asked. Thomas pulled out his smartphone and opened a video application. "I want you to tell the world exactly who ordered Sarah's kidnapping and why." I want you to name every government official who took bribes, every executive who approved the operation, every politician who cleared the legal obstacles. They'll kill me if I talk. They might, Thomas agreed. But I'm here right now, and I promise you that if you don't talk, you won't live to see whether they follow through on their threats. Webb looked into Thomas's eyes and saw something that convinced him. This wasn't an empty threat from some reservation Indian trying to sound tough. This was a promise from a man who had killed before and would kill again if necessary to protect his people. The confession video that Webb recorded in that Denver hotel bar lasted 47 minutes and named over 24 co-conspirators in the land grab scheme. By the time Thomas uploaded it to social media, Webb was already on a plane to a country without an extradition treaty, running from both his former employers and the federal prosecutors, who now had enough evidence to dismantle the entire operation. The third man Thomas visited was Richard Blackstone himself. The CEO had retreated to his penthouse apartment in Manhattan, surrounded by private security and convinced that his wealth and connections would insulate him from consequences. His security team was experienced and well-armed, trained to deal with corporate espionage and financial rivals. They weren't trained to deal with Thomas Redhawk. Thomas had spent weeks studying the building's layout, the security protocols, and the personal habits of everyone involved. When he decided to visit Blackstone, he didn't come through the front door or make any dramatic gestures. He simply appeared in Blackstone's private office at 2 a.m, sitting behind the executive's desk like he owned the place. Blackstone woke up to find a man in traditional Lakota war paint sitting in his chair, examining financial documents with the casual interest of someone reviewing a grocery list. The CEO's first instinct was to call for security, but Thomas held up a finger in a gesture that somehow commanded silence. "Your security team is sleeping," Thomas said calmly. "I used a drug that will keep them unconscious for several hours. They're not hurt, but they're not going to help you." Blackstone tried to maintain his composure, but seeing a man who looked like he had stepped out of a history book sitting in his private office was more unnerving than any corporate threat he had ever faced. "What do you want?" Blackstone asked, unconsciously echoing the same question Webb had asked in Denver. "I want you to understand something," Thomas replied, standing up from the chair with fluid grace. "My people have been fighting men like you for over 200 years. You think you're the first to try to steal our land? You think your guns and money and government connections make you special?" Thomas moved around the desk with the kind of predatory stalking motion that triggered instinctive fear responses in prey animals and corporate executives alike. "The difference between you and the cavalry soldiers who came before you is that they were honest about their intentions," Thomas continued. "They wanted to kill us and take our land, and they said so. You hide behind lawyers and corporations and government agencies, but your goal is the same. You want to destroy us." Blackstone was backing toward the window now, though he wasn't consciously aware of his movement. Something primordial in his brain was screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. "I'm not going to kill you," Thomas said, and Blackstone felt a moment of relief. "But I'm going to destroy everything you've built, everyone you care about, and every plan you've made for the future. When I'm finished, you'll wish I had just killed you." The prophecy began fulfilling itself before Thomas even left the building. By dawn, every major news network in the world was running stories about Blackstone Development's collapse, complete with internal documents showing the company's involvement in attempted child murder. International arrest warrants were being issued, and governments in 3 countries were freezing assets associated with the company. But Thomas wasn't finished. The hunt would continue until everyone who had threatened Sarah Whitefeather faced the consequences of their actions, and until the world understood that there were still warriors among the Lakota people who would protect their children at any cost. 6 months after Sarah Whitefeather's rescue from the railroad tracks, the world had changed in ways that few people could have predicted. What began as one man's quest for justice had become a global movement that transformed how corporations approached indigenous land rights forever. The final domino in Thomas Redhawk's campaign fell on a cold February morning when Richard Blackstone was arrested at JFK Airport trying to board a private jet to Switzerland. The former CEO of Blackstone Development looked nothing like the confident executive who had once threatened entire communities over the phone. His hair had gone gray, his expensive suits hung loose on his diminished frame, and his eyes carried the haunted look of a man who had learned what it meant to be hunted. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case using the evidence Thomas had gathered over 3 years of investigation. Conspiracy, attempted murder, bribery of government officials, environmental crimes, and violations of the Indian Civil Rights Act were just the beginning of a list of charges that would keep Blackstone in federal prison for the rest of his life. But the legal victory was only part of Thomas's revenge. The real punishment came from watching everything Blackstone had built crumble into dust. His company's assets were seized and sold to pay restitution to the dozens of communities that had been victimized by his land grab schemes. His personal fortune vanished into legal fees and civil settlements. His political allies abandoned him the moment the scandal broke, and his family members changed their names to escape the shame of association with him. Marcus Webb, the man who had actually tied the ropes around Sarah's wrists, met a different fate. After recording his confession in that Denver hotel bar, he had fled to a small country in South America, hoping to disappear forever. But Thomas Redhawk's network of contacts included people Webb never imagined existed. Former military comrades, indigenous rights activists, and even members of international criminal organizations who respected Thomas's reputation helped track the fugitive across 3 continents. Webb was found 6 months later in a remote village in Bolivia, working as a manual laborer under a false identity. The local authorities, who had been well compensated for their cooperation, turned him over to a team of FBI agents who had been patiently waiting for this moment. As Webb was loaded onto the plane that would bring him back to face American justice, he caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the airport terminal. Thomas Redhawk stood motionless among the crowd of travelers, wearing the same casual clothes he had worn in the Denver hotel. He didn't speak or gesture, but Webb understood the message perfectly. There was nowhere on earth where the Lakota warrior couldn't find him if he chose to hunt. The third kidnapper, James Morrison, never made it to trial. 2 weeks after Sarah's rescue, he was found dead in his jail cell, apparently the victim of a heart attack brought on by extreme stress. The official autopsy found no evidence of foul play, but fellow inmates reported that Morrison had been having nightmares every night, waking up screaming about being stalked by wolves through endless forests. Thomas never confirmed or denied any involvement in Morrison's death, but those who knew him best understood that there were some debts that could only be paid in the old way, according to laws that predated courtrooms and judges by thousands of years. The ripple effects of Thomas's campaign extended far beyond individual justice. The documentation he had released exposed a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, leading to congressional hearings, regulatory reforms, and new laws protecting indigenous land rights. International mining companies that had viewed Native American reservations as easy targets suddenly found themselves facing organized resistance, sophisticated legal challenges, and public relations nightmares that made their previous tactics impossible to continue. Sarah Whitefeather became an unlikely symbol of resilience and hope for indigenous communities around the world. Her story was told in documentaries, books, and news articles in dozens of languages. She received letters of support from children in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and dozens of other countries where indigenous peoples faced similar pressures from corporate interests. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah remained a normal 8-year-old girl who picked berries, visited her great-aunt, and learned traditional songs from her grandmother. The trauma of her ordeal had left its mark, but the love and protection of her community had given her the strength to heal. She still walked the same path along the railroad tracks every morning, but now she was accompanied by other children and watched over by adults who would never again allow their young ones to face such dangers alone. Thomas Redhawk found peace in ways he had never expected. The rage that had driven his 3-year investigation gradually transformed into something deeper and more purposeful. He established a foundation that provided security training and legal support to indigenous communities facing corporate pressure. The old warrior skills passed down from his grandfather combined with modern technology and global networks to create a new kind of protection for his people. On the first anniversary of Sarah's rescue, the Pine Ridge Reservation held a ceremony that brought together people from across the Americas. Traditional dancers performed alongside contemporary musicians. Elders shared stories with young activists, and survivors of similar corporate attacks found strength in their shared experiences. Thomas stood at the edge of the celebration, watching Sarah laugh with her friends as they played games near the very railroad tracks where she had almost died. The sight filled him with a satisfaction that went beyond revenge or justice. This was what he had really been fighting for: the simple right of children to be children, to grow up surrounded by love and tradition, to inherit a world where their heritage would be respected rather than exploited. As the sun set over the reservation, painting the sky in colors that reminded everyone of the sacred nature of the land they protected, Thomas felt the presence of his ancestors. They had fought cavalry soldiers and government agents, survived massacres and forced relocations, endured generations of attempts to destroy their culture and steal their land. Now, in an age of corporations and global markets, the fight continued with new enemies and new weapons, but the same unbreakable spirit that had sustained his people for centuries. Sarah Whitefeather would grow up knowing that she was protected, not just by laws and courts, but by warriors who carried the wisdom of the past and the tools of the future. She would learn that justice sometimes came slowly and sometimes came swiftly, but it always came to those who had the courage to stand up for what was right. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the celebration, Thomas Red Hawk smiled as he thought about the corporate executives and government officials who still believed they could intimidate his people. They had no idea what was waiting for them if they ever decided to test the resolve of the Lakota again. The hunt would always continue, because there would always be those who needed protection, and there would always be warriors ready to provide it. The railroad tracks that had once symbolized danger and exploitation now stood as a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The story of the little girl tied to the tracks had ended, but the legend of Thomas Red Hawk and his people's refusal to surrender had just begun.